My name is Jason. I'm a senior SRE at Abacus Insights. At Abacus Insights, we're working on empowering patients and their data to have better health outcomes. I'm coming live from you from Somerville on a busy main street. So if you start hearing sirens and things, nothing's wrong, just normal city life. So I'm have, coming up from a non-tech background into more senior tech role, I've definitely had a lot of experiences in how Agile has worked or not worked in companies. And I kind of thought like some of these experiences could offer some interesting insight on the best way to start, approaching Agile in an ops setting. Some people say ops just doesn't work for such things, but I found it can be very powerful to transform your daily work. Now, just some disclaimers here. I am not an Agile expert in any way. I'm not one of those, Agile gurus that comes in and solves really complicated problems. I'm not a certified Scrum Master. I started in on the, training to do that, but I never took the certification test or anything. And I'm not going to be teaching you the nuts and bolts of Scrum and Kanban. If you've never really worked with Scrum and Kanban, and so what I'm talking about sounds a bit of gibberish, but kind of interesting, you probably should go and start learning about that. And then, then you can come back maybe, and hopefully this will be available somewhere for you to rewatch. What I am trying to do is to give you tools to think about how to empower your ops teams, and this is kind of like a good starting point on hopefully your journey. So, why do Agile at all? I get that question. A lot of people see Agile as just more these burdensome processes that, they feel have maybe questionable benefits. But I find that within the Agile methodology, there's a lot of tools to actually start solving problems that ops teams specifically face themselves. Too often we kind of mostly see Scrum that was more tailored to solving developer team problems. It allows you to both predict and improve your capacity. A lot of ops teams are very feel overburdened with work. They feel like they're in this hole of tech debt, and that just more stuff just keeps piling on their team. And that's something true. I mean, you can't, Agile can't fix a personnel problem, but it can hopefully make it a bit more manageable and to present to management this is what we can do, and this is what we could do with more people. And also, you can do more impactful work. The question for your organization is going to be: is ops a fix the tickets, or is it going to be we're going to move your organization forward? So you can actually start having organizations that you kind of read about and hear about in DevOps days and in the books. You can read about them all day, but unless you have a way for your work to be impactful and move towards that, it can be kind of pointless. And also make your team feel more empowered within the organization. A lot of times we just feel like we are getting what developers need, or because something server went down, our service went down, we're sort of feel like work just gets dumped on us. But this allows, I think, you to feel more empowered, to have more control over your daily work. And I've seen organizations where the developers feel jealous of the ops teams because they felt like, we were more empowered to pick our projects than they were. So ops before Scrum. My first real system engineering job, or whatever you want to call it, we didn't have any daily stand-up. We just had a pile of tickets. They were represented in Jira, but we weren't really working through Jira. Jira, just a ticket was a way to track work. They didn't have any meaningful story around them. But the developers, I noticed every day at a certain time, went into this big room and stood around the room, and my boss went in there too. And so this is kind of my first big job in the city. And, eventually, after a while, I worked up the courage. I'm like, so what's that meeting every day? And they're like, oh, that's stand up. People talk about, um, what they're doing for that day. I'm like, oh, do you talk about us? He's like, only if it's like something really major. So, this was something that kind of happened outside. Ops, our work arrived on plan. Oftentimes, like someone from QA or a developer would come by, stand over kind of like the team and wait for like one of us to stop typing and look up at him. And he would be like, I have this problem. And, we'd have to put down what we're doing and, try and see if that, it was like the only, if we really needed it, usually yes. The only time we could ever really give any pushback is like if there was a system down and we're like, our systems are down, come back later. That was the only pushback we could ever have, and that's not really a win. So we always had like many tickets in flight. I remember like some days it felt like I was working on 9 or 10 projects, and when you're switching this context all the time, you lose a bit of context and you have to get back up to speed. So it's not very efficient. This is a recreation of what my desk looked like back then. I decided I just got like so frustrated that there's so much going on and like I didn't feel like it was respected. So I was like, okay, here's everything I'm working on as a sticky note. And I was hoping that when someone came over and like, hey, I need this job, I'm like, well, look at all this stuff I'm doing. And they'd be like, well, it's a blocker and it's going to prevent release on Friday if I don't have it done. So, I very exasperatedly moved the ticket I was working on back into the stack. And I had to, say, fix his broken Hudson server. So this was sort of our life at the time. But so lesson number 1 for me was individual workloads aren't respected oftentimes in an organization. So, but eventually, the company grew. We got bought by a much bigger company, and we had an entire ops organization. And the director of operations was like, "You should do Scrum." And someone on our team knew Scrum. He's like, "Okay, let's do Scrum." And so I call this Scrum 1.0 in my career. And it first started with the same, kind of guy from QA came over and says, "Hey, I have this issue." And he responded, it's like, "Great, we're going to do grooming on Thursday. Make sure to get it in by then, and we'll be sure to get into the sprint. And it'll be done in the next sprint at 2-week span." And then he responds, "I need it by Friday." And pretty soon we realized that the traditional Scrum framework of planning work just wasn't going to cut it. So our director said, well, what most people in the organization do, most ops teams, is that they bifurcate their work. The planned sprints were 40 to 60% of your expected work capacity, meaning this was the work that you plan to do. The other half of work just was going to be unexpected. And so that never really set well for me. I'm like, well, this system's only modeling half. It's not operating as a capacity control. So still much ops work still arrived unplanned, and that's where we were. So lesson 2, ops needs to meet the needs of developers and business. No matter what kind of awesome, agile system, it kind of, they don't exist internally. You have external people who have needs. So I eventually went to another company, and we were at that time just reforming the ops team, and we sat down on what we want to do. And one of my coworkers, actually my boss, was like, "We should do Kanban." And I'm like, "Okay, I've heard that word." So, and I had previously raised my hand. Yeah, sure, I'll be Scrum Master because, why not? And so I went home and learned everything I could about Kanban. And then I designed what I thought was an amazing Kanban system and brought it down from the mountain to them. And when I came back, we had another meeting, And I'm like, oh, okay, so instead of having sprints that where we decide work, we're going to have a just one queue that we'll work from. We're going to have these um, work limits. We're going to keep the work in progress down, and then we're going to have. I made swim lanes, so like emergency and deadline work could be prioritized over just project work. And we'd have all these regular meetings. We'll do stand up every day. We'll have retros look back, and we'll have grooming. And my boss kind of looked at me weird, and he's like, "But I just wanted fewer meetings." Kanban, some people see Kanban as just, you make a queue and then you just go, you don't actually tailor it. And that is kind of like missing a lot of the power of Kanban, and, doesn't always usually doesn't produce great results. So eventually after talking in several more meetings, a lot of people, we kind of decided to try my methods, and I think it worked fairly well. Unfortunately, we didn't have previous metrics to really measure that up. And, one thing like Kanban works sometimes better in an iterative approach where you're making changes and seeing how that affects your work. So lesson number 3 was never assume words mean the same to everyone. And I had an extra S there just because all words. No, that's a typo. So, and then later on, there was a troubled project that came up. We just weren't communicating well. The developers were saying Ops is not provisioning the infra we wanted, and we tried to provision infra, and so we were like complaining. The developer is not explaining his needs. We can't do what he wants unless we know what he wants, and so the solution we had was we'll send an ops person to the dev team stand-up, and that was me. And now probably 90% of that stand-up was not germane to what I was needing to do, but that like 10% of time where we actually got to talk about the project with all the stakeholders in the room was really powerful. It allowed me to go back and do the work that was needed. It got, we were happy, the developers were happy, the people working from, that were asking the developers to do this, they were pretty happy. But, if we had done this earlier, then I think the project would have been designed even better, and the other bumps in the road could have been smoothed out ahead of time. So lesson number 4, break down communication silos. Just because you're doing your agile thing over here doesn't mean you should just completely ignore the people doing their agile thing over there. Sometimes you just have to, break down these communications silos that we kind of like artificially put up in our workplaces and just go and have that individual interaction. So then later on, when I joined another company, I call this Kanban 2.0, we kind of fell into doing something called Scrumban, which has different meanings, but the idea is you kind of still in Scrum, but you start adding in some Kanban elements into it to smooth over things that are the rough spots in the process. So we built on Scrum using some Kanban processes. One of the things we did was, rather than estimate how long a ticket was going to take, we just tried to make them bite size as much as possible. If a ticket seemed big, break it up into 2 tickets. And so we didn't have the estimation. Then we use sprints for metrics, not planning out what we're going to do. So every 2 weeks we looked back, this is what we accomplished. What was our flight looking like? How many tickets did we do? What issues did we have? So the sprints were more of a way just to time box our metrics. And then we use work in progress limits for capacity planning, rather than saying, well, I think we can only do this much in 2 weeks. Instead, we said, everyone can only work on 1 ticket at a time, or some variation of that. And both planning, this limited amount of tickets for a sprint are work in progress, are both capacity limit um, controls, and that's why, like, when you're in Jira and you try and add a ticket to a sprint, and it, like, what you really want to do is changes the scope, because you're basically breaking Scrum at that point, and you could be causing less efficiency in your sprints. And then we pulled work from the top of the queue. Sometimes in Scrum, when the sprint's starting, you just decide, okay, so-and-so is doing this ticket, so-and-so is doing this ticket. Instead, whatever ticket was on the top and you were done with your previous ticket, you pulled that one. One of the great results of that was it helped break down these knowledge silos. Like, we had the Terraform guy. He was, he's brilliant, but new person who is still kind of poking around Terraform, he gets the update Terraform ticket, and they have to get up to speed and, like, learn how his code works. And this is really important for a lot of ops teams, that if you're on call, you necessarily don't want to have to call the subject matter expert. You want that knowledge spread out through your team. So lesson number 5 was spread the work to prevent knowledge silos. You can still kind of do this in a Scrum situation by more randomly pointing tickets, or like, hey, who knows how to do this ticket the least, and assign it to them. But you have to be a little more intentional. If you just work, off the top of a queue, you sort of have that built in to your system. So Scrum 3.0, I call this the return. I went to another company, and at first I was like, it's Scrum, and they're doing, like, the 60-40 split that I thought was, like, not really good. And, like, I was like, I wonder if I should, like, try and get them to change this. But what happened was I observed 3 new things that I hadn't encountered yet that were so impactful. It really rendered, like, my personal opinion about what's the best looking agile system kind of secondary and unimportant. We had 20% engineering time, which it allowed, like, work that didn't neatly fit into a sprint to get done. This was supposed to be work that's important to the organization that didn't neatly fall into what people were, clamoring for, but we as a team thought was important. We used team goals to plan work. We were like, okay, well, what do we want to accomplish in 3 months? And be like, well, we want to be on Terraform or something like that. And this gave, what tickets we were choosing importance. And we weren't just, working off a bunch of tech debt. Instead, we had goals for ourselves. And then we used metrics that got generated through our sprints to identify toil and help set these goals. So when we saw, like, provisioning new services, we had, this was a huge chunk of our tickets. That became the goal. Well, let's eliminate this in the next quarter. So lesson number 6 is know where you're going. Give structure. As ops, we usually don't have project managers telling us, we're working on this project. So sometimes you need to figure out impactful projects and explain how it's important to your organization. You don't want managers thinking about ops, that's just a cost center. Be a benefit, like a center that gives benefit to the company. And then what do you do after you automate the toil? You find more toil. As your organization grows, new toil. Things that once were the thing that eliminated toil will become toil. So this is a continuing process. So lesson number 7, as your organization grows, new forms of toil will appear. So my Agile for Ops suggestions, don't change for change's sake. We talk about the guy that comes in and he wants to install Kubernetes before he knows what kind of tech needs you have. Maybe Kubernetes isn't the best solution, even though you like it the most. You might love Kanban. Doesn't mean you should just say, we're now doing Kanban because I have arrived. Instead, concentrate at first, observe, model your work, and gather your metrics. From this, you can start identifying pain points that people are having. And then you all want to collaborate on solutions. There's sometimes you do have really great tech gurus, but the best gurus that come in there even, they want consensus build. They build consensus. They want everyone on board. If people on your team are going to be dragging their heels, this is not going to work well. You want to collaborate on the solution and get everyone on board. And then retro and repeat. What happened? Did this improve things? Maybe we need to try something else. Just because I know this solution doesn't mean it's the right one. So looking back at this old model, well, I kind of modeled this, my work. It was chaos, but it was modeled. What happens if I try to bring some sanity to this? Like, okay, instead of a big blob of tickets, I now have a queue, and I've marked off, this is what I'm working, and I'm working on one thing at a time now. And let's say there's now another queue. These are the kind of interrupt work. And my boss is the one who, say, makes those tickets, and he puts on, the date that needs to be done. I now, this is not like a real system, but even without any Jira or anything, I've sort of started improving my life already. To me, this feels so less stressful. So, again, I don't suggest use sticky notes, especially we're all remote, but this just shows it's not about the tools that you necessarily have. It's just starting to look at what you have and think through it. So whether it's Scrum, Kanban, or Scrumban, a great thing to start really looking at is the capacity controls, especially in ops. This is what always is biting us. Sometimes, on the other, sometimes you have ops people who they feel like they have nothing to do. Everything's working good. Well, they need to do more things, maybe think of projects to improve on. So final thought is that Agile is best when it empowers teams. If Agile feels disempowering to your team or to you, you probably are missing something here. So remember to always continue learning. I'm continuing learning. Things that really affected my thoughts on this is Kanban by Dave Anderson. He talked about how to observe and change teams. He talked about capacity. Now when I'm stuck in traffic or stuck in the MBTA, I start thinking of how could capacity theory fix this? Which is a little bit better than just being kind of frustrated. And then Scrumban essays on Kanban systems. This is really good about how to evolve a Scrum system and just don't feel locked into Scrum. I think it's really empowering. And then Development That Pays. It's a really great YouTube channel. To me, it really help distinguish these different systems. The guy that runs it has a lot of great stories and success stories. So I definitely recommend those. So those are my 3 personal favorite. There's a ton of great material out there. So and so that'll be it. And let's move on to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Jason. That was a great journey through all things Agile and Ops. Also in the chat, we have a lot of sticky note love. I also have copious amounts of sticky notes, so I'm right there with you. All right, let's kick this thing off. First question will be, if there's no one-size-fits-all model, how can I set up my team to succeed if I don't know what will work for us?
Well, yeah, that's true. You don't know what's going to work for you. You never do. I think you have to be not thinking why won't this work, but what does it hurt to try? Where you are now, unless you're oh, we're in a great position now, maybe you don't want to, mess that up. But if things are bad, it doesn't hurt to try something. So you just have to pick something and try it. Kanban is usually, if you don't have any sort of organization, it's a good way of just starting to put a little bit more logic behind the chaos, because it's a bit more lightweight.
Okay, great. What thematically tends to work best? Likewise, what tends to not work?
Thematically is, again, just getting everyone on board. What usually doesn't work, and this is the mistake I made the first time I was a Scrum Master, was saying I have done all the research and I have determined that this is the best way of doing it. That doesn't work. It's just talking through things and like proposing solutions and just trying to get people on, on board. And, I wouldn't try and just make all the changes at once, make a change, iterative changes. It's all about slowly improving over time, not just all of a sudden, you don't just install, say, this new software management system and then everything works great. It's all about the continuing improvement of your team.
I love it. All right, I've got a question as well, because I loved how you mentioned kind of embedding the ops group into the dev stand-ups. Have you been in organizations that also have experimented with embedding that ops person for a longer period of time rather than just kind of in the stand-up?
Well, yeah, actually, right now at Abacus Insights, that's what we're doing. We've all, we still have our SRE team, but we're all now embedded in one of the major development teams. And the hope is to get better information going back and forth for us to start bringing operational knowledge into what the developers are doing, and then two, kind of to see what developers are doing and bring that back to us so we know and are ready and can help, either mitigate or make that better.
I love it. Yeah, I have a very similar experience. Great. Okay, so how do you factor in voices in your organization that say Agile should work this particular way?
I guess it all depends on like how much power you have. They have, like, if it's a manager or if it's your Scrum coach. I can't imagine a Scrum coach saying that. When I remember in my organization, when we said, "Oh, we're going to do Kanban," they're like, "Oh, okay," even though their main thing was, doing Scrum. But I don't know if someone, especially like in your team, that says we got to do it that way. This is Scrum. We do it this way. Then I don't know. Do it that way. It might be a good way to start, and then use metrics to say, "Hey, why don't we make this little change?" I think of like the parable of the stone soup parable, where the person only has the rock to make soup, and like this other person was like, "Oh, I have no food to add. Well, join in on my stone soup." And then little by little, like, "Oh, this would be even a little bit better if we add a little flour." And like, "Oh, I have a little flour. Oh, I have a little salt." And then before you know, they're adding like potatoes and stuff, and like there's this huge soup made by just a stone. But it's just, say, okay, we can do it that way, and then try and make little changes and along the way.
Love it. All right, we got a question from the chat. Thank you, Christina. The question is, would you please explain a little bit more about the 60-40 rule for handling unplanned work? And what's your recent experiences that's proved that out?
Okay, yes. The 60-40 rule, basically it's like you assume that's like, say, 40% of your time is going to be spent on things that you can't plan for, whether systems have gone down or developers are like, "Oh, I need this new thing by tomorrow." And it's just stuff that you can't really plan out 2 weeks in advance. So you assume there's going to be this block of time. So maybe while a development team says, "Oh, we're going to do 40 tickets," you say, "Well, we can do, under 40 tickets, 40 points worth of tickets." You say, "We can only do 25 points of tickets." And then you assume the other 15 is going to come from this interrupt work. It's definitely a bit awkward. One of the things we've done at Abacus Insights is we've been trying out for the ops team single week sprints. And this made it a lot easier to just have less interrupt, because you can say something, "Well, can we do it next week?" And a lot of times they're like, "Oh, okay, that's fine." And so it kind of lowers some of the interrupt work. It still happens, but.
Okay, great. I think we got time for maybe one more. As a member of the Boston DevOps community, have you heard of any good examples of other members succeeding?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't grilled down someone, but I definitely heard some people, you get, different reactions. Some people like their, agile setup. Some people might think it's burdensome. I know Spotify has a lot of great information, like their ops team describing what they're doing. To me, that was very inspiring. And that when I was first trying to develop a Kanban system, I read a bit from them.
Awesome. And I know you went over this just a little bit, but is there anything kind of in parting words? Is there anything that you're trying at your current org, and how's that working out?
Oh yeah, so a lot of it is, trying out this matrix thing, because our big issue was like kind of feeling siloed there, and like just the needing to spread this information. We want to help teach people some production excellence, and bring that in. And so like for us, that is the major issue. Like I haven't really, said, oh, well, we should adjust to maybe Scrum Bound or something like that, because I don't feel like, we're having capacity issues. I mean, sometimes, if we get to the point where there's a lot of like, context switching, maybe we'll look at like, hey, we'll put a work in progress limit. But, that's all about, try and solve for the problems you have, not the problems you don't have. And just because you like a system. And so I think that's like an important, one of my favorite takeaways from this. I always think about, install Kubernetes, everywhere. No, it's like personal interactions is what's going to really empower your organization with your team and with other teams.
Awesome. All right, so that wraps up our segment with Q&A. We're going to spin off into a breakout. And so for those who have any remaining questions in the chat, thanks again. We're going to just continue that on over into the breakout.